G'day everyone, it's Daniel Patterson. I'm a forensic toxicologist in Australia. So the first thing I'd like to ask is, do you think I'd make a good lawyer? Because I think I'd make an absolutely terrible lawyer. I don't have the patience for dealing with nonsense in a courtroom all day. I also do not have the experience or the knowledge to become a lawyer. I don't know what it's like to write or receive briefs. I don't really know all the courtroom procedure stuff beyond what I've personally had to go through when I come to court and give expert evidence, when I take my little oath up on the stand. I know those procedures really well. I know the laws I need to know to write my reports, so the UCPR, the rules of the court, that sort of stuff. I know little bits about the Evidence Act to make sure my reports don't get kicked out under 135 or 138. But that doesn't make me a lawyer. So that's why I do get a little irritated when I see lawyers playing scientist, and it happens a lot more often than I like to see it happen. Recently, I had a really disturbing matter, and I'm actually on the fence about reporting this legal practitioner involved to the Law Society. So what we had was a matter where we had orders issued by a JR. They were rubber-stamped consent orders, and honestly, they were really crappy consent orders. They might as well have been written in crayon. But anyway, they were more or less going to be the end of the family court matter. Well, what's happened is part of that order is that the father has to undergo 4 hair tests a year, so a hair test every 3 months. And provided he passes those, he can still keep seeing the kids in the shared custody part. If he fails a hair test, as in produces a positive drug for ordinarily illicit drugs, then he does not get to see the kids for 6 months, and he has to still do the hair tests and get a clean one. Now, right off the bat, there's nothing too unreasonable about those orders. Me as an ordinary observer looking outside in, there's nothing really untoward about that. What is untoward is when the other side, which is legally represented, writes a letter to the father to say, you have failed your last hair test. Now they then take the children away from him for 6 months. What he failed the hair test for was amphetamine. Amphetamine does indeed metabolize from methylamphetamine, ice, meth, whatever you want to call it. But it also metabolizes from lisdexamphetamine and dexamphetamine, both of which are legitimately prescribed ADHD medications. Both of which he has been prescribed for multiple years. It was not news to either party he was prescribed those medications, especially when his wife had clearly lived with him for multiple years and knows that he was diagnosed with ADHD. What happened in this case was absolutely terrible. It was incompetent lawyering on the side of the mother, and the father had to go and get a lawyer and then hire me to deal with this, and that was not cheap for him either. A baseless allegation made by the mother's side resulted in him paying a lawyer, I would guess, anything between $200 and $400 an hour, and paying me in total about $700 to deal with the other side, write a report, do all that sort of stuff. And at the end of it, all of this could have been saved by them picking up the phone, calling any lab, any doctor, any scientist who would have explained, no numbnuts, amphetamine does not mean illegal drug use. Were they prescribed ADHD medications? Oh yeah, they were. Well, there you go, that's where your amphetamines come from. Now, the letter looked like it was written by AI, and I don't mean because of how it was worded or anything like that. I mean, it looked like it was written by AI because of the format of the table and the emoji, like little tick box thing. Yes, that made it look like it was AI. And since it's apparently okay to do each other's jobs, I'll just play the lawyer here and say, I believe they unlawfully denied him access to his children and contravened the orders themselves. So I'm actually on the fence about reporting that legal practitioner, but also I hope that the father does follow through with a contravention application, and I hope they are successful, because there is no way that this person should ever have been put in that position. There are people that kill themselves when they lose custody of their children and have to fight false allegations and that sort of thing. So I do take it quite seriously when I see a lawyer who probably did not attend many science classes in Year 7 or Year 8 trying to play scientist and ruining someone's life in the process. If they did not have the ability to get a lawyer, and if that lawyer did not reach out to me, then who knows how this would have ended. Not with him getting his kids back, that's for sure. The simple fact is, no one should have needed to have come to me anyway, other than maybe the mother or her lawyer picking up the phone and calling me. I would have explained to them over the phone that this is not at all consistent with illegal drug use. In fact, the report itself acknowledges that this is consistent with his ADHD medication he's declared, and the use is legitimate if prescribed. If they'd have actually read the report, they would have seen that. So, yes, I do get a bit fired up about that. Now that that rant is over, let's talk about actual metabolites. What is a metabolite? Well, a metabolite really is just what a drug transforms into as it goes through your body. So what we were talking about just then, amphetamine, in this context is a metabolite. Now, some drugs can be both a parent drug and a metabolite, which we'll talk about especially when we're talking about benzodiazepines. But for now, let's keep it quite simple. We're going to go through the most common ones you're going to deal with in court, which are going to be amphetamine-type substances, cocaine, cannabinoids, benzos, and opiates. Now, let's start with amphetamine-type substances. We pretty much just covered that in my rant, but we have methylamphetamine, meth or ice, whatever you'd like to call it, which metabolizes to amphetamine. But on the legal side, we also have lisdexamphetamine and dexamphetamine, which do metabolize to amphetamine. So they are, once again, legal drugs that can show as amphetamine, and in fact will show as amphetamine. Now, when we're talking amphetamines, we also can't leave out ecstasy. Methylene dioxymethylamphetamine, MDMA, ecstasy. We know that MDMA metabolizes to methylene dioxyamphetamine, MDA, which is also, in rare cases, a standalone drug. You can just do MDA. You don't have to do full ecstasy. Now let's move on to cocaine. Cocaine is quite interesting, mainly because of what one of the metabolites are. Now, cocaine is the parent drug, but it gets broken down very quickly into benzoylecgonine. Benzoylecgonine is the primary metabolite of cocaine. We are always going to find it if someone uses cocaine. But then we get other metabolites which we might find, like norcocaine and agonine methyl ester, and the most interesting metabolite, cocoethylene. Cocoethylene is a substance that is formed when cocaine and ethanol, alcohol, mix in the liver. That is sometimes very helpful to find and know what that means. For instance, about 2 years ago, I had to appear in a criminal law matter where it was relevant whether or not the person was drunk at the time they took cocaine. Because if they were drunk at the time they took cocaine, that was actually going to be a mitigating thing for them. If they were not, it was going to be an aggravating thing for them. The presence of cocoethylene definitely suggested that they had been consuming heavy amounts of alcohol whilst simultaneously doing cocaine. So yes, that was something that we could demonstrate for the court. Now let's move on to cannabinoids. The main cannabinoid obviously is THC. Now that is what most labs just look for, but there's also other metabolites we really need to consider. For instance, we need to look for carboxy-THC, because that carboxy-THC, which can also be reported as THCA, THC acid, or THC-COOH, in any case, it is the metabolite of THC. It is how we can prove you have used THC. In fact, in a urine test, that's all we are looking for. We are not looking for THC, we're looking for the metabolite of it. So, that is one of the metabolites we look for. But there's also other compounds we look for in cannabinoids to see, is it legitimate or are you being a bit cheeky here? So what we might look for as well is CBD, cannabidiol. Now that's a Schedule 3 over-the-counter medication these days, so we can't really draw any adverse inferences. But then we have something that sounds similar called cannabinol. And that tells us a lot about what weed are you using. So we get some very cheeky, silly people that they'll go and get a legitimate cannabis prescription, which basically means they had a spare $70 and 3 minutes on the phone to a doctor. But they don't even want to do that. They'll get the prescription, they'll buy the first batch, but then they'll buy cannabis from Old Mate, where we don't know anything about it, it's just bushweed, but then they go and put it in the tub. Well, fine. The problem is bushweed grown in the same conditions that medical cannabis is? Nope, absolutely not. Bushweed is exposed to a lot of things like heat and air and all those sorts of things, which produce something called cannabinol. We do not find cannabinol in any real detectable quantity in medicinal cannabis stored properly. What that tells us is when we find cannabinol, you have used illegal cannabis, illicit cannabis. This is not pharmaceutical grade or medicinal grade cannabis. Now, benzodiazepines. This is one, like I said earlier, that a lot of metabolites could also be parent drugs on their own. So, for instance, let's look at diazepam, which is one of the most well-known benzodiazepines. It's under the brand name of Valium. Well, that starts out as diazepam. Then, as it goes through the body, it becomes nordiazepam, a metabolite. It then becomes temazepam, which is also another standalone drug. You can just get temazepam on its own. The temazepam then becomes oxazepam. So, when we find all of those things in someone's hair or urine, what we are looking at is the use of a benzodiazepine. We can clearly see that diazepam has become nordiazepam, which has become temazepam, which has become oxazepam. I have once had to correct a magistrate very gently when he said, well, I can see that this is illegal use of substances because they're prescribed diazepam, but I know that temazepam's another drug. I've had to very gently correct them that you are not wrong, Your Honour, that yes, temazepam is a drug on its own, but it is actually a metabolite of nordiazepam. So yes, it's sort of both, and he did accept that, and thankfully we moved on, and there was nothing more for me to say much after that. So yes, that does sometimes cause issues, even on the bench, that they might be familiar with it, because if you go into a doctor, then usually not going to just give you a box of diazepam. They'll probably start you on something like temazepam because it is weaker, and it doesn't have a ridiculous 36-hour half-life or something like that. So when we get into opiates, we're basically just looking at parent drugs here. So morphine is morphine. Codeine is codeine. The only time we're really looking at a metabolite is heroin. The proper name for heroin is diacetylmorphine. The metabolite for diacetylmorphine is 6-monoacetylmorphine, 6-MAM. That is what we are actually looking for. Now, in some tests, they might look for both, and that is great, but sort of unnecessary, because what does the metabolite tell us? Well, the metabolite tells us that the parent drug must have been involved, but the parent drug does not mean that the drug was consumed. So what I mean by that is, if I find benzoylecgonine, I don't really need to read the next line to say cocaine was used, because it's not free floating around in the air. You have to use the cocaine to get the benzoylecgonine. It's produced when your body starts to deal with the cocaine. But if I find just cocaine and no metabolites, I don't have proof of drug use. I've got proof that you've been near drugs. I've got proof that someone near you might have used drugs. So if there's something to understand very clearly about these things, it is that the metabolites help us determine drug use. The parent drugs do not determine drug use. So when you are finding a high amount of a parent drug, like say methamphetamine or cocaine, present, but you are not finding any metabolites present, it's worth asking, how did they actually determine the use of the substance if that's what's being reported? Because in very many cases, the parent drug alone, I will not sign off that that is use of the substance, because I do not have evidence of use. I have evidence that that substance was detected. That does not mean that you smoked it or injected it or used it in any way. Now, if in doubt, Call a pharmacist, call a doctor, call a toxicologist. I don't charge lawyers to answer questions. So, yes, there are other ways to do it that do not involve ruining people's lives and stepping over into potentially disrespecting an expert by trying to do their job without the skills, knowledge, or experience required to do it. So I hope this helps. If you'd like anything specific covered, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll think of a topic for the next video. Take care.